Hi folks, today we're going to be tackling a rather controversial subject. Moses, the Exodus, and its connection to ancient Egypt. Here on Lessons from the Purple Chair. Hi, and welcome back to Lessons from the Purple Chair. One intellectual's musings from the comfort of a big purple wingback. I'm your host, Professor Timothy R. Crowe. Okay guys, as I said in the intro, I'm going to be tackling a rather controversial subject today. That being of Moses and the Exodus and its connection to ancient Egypt. And therefore I feel like that I need to give a bit of a disclaimer. Now, when I speak on religions or on religious texts or scriptures, I'm talking from a scholarly perspective, not from a faith-based or belief-based perspective. That's what comparative religious studies professors do. You know, I'm not interested in the actual belief and the faith, at least in this context, you know, of these texts and of these stories and myths. But I'm more interested in the exegesis of the scriptures and texts, of comparing it to known history, to archaeological evidence, to sociological and cultural evidence, and coming up with conclusions. So therefore, you know, what I want to be talking about is not meant to be any type of insult to anyone's personal faith. You know, if you have a fundamentalist faith in a certain scripture, that, of course, is your prerogative, and that is your right. You know, and you should be, free to practice and believe that. However, bear in mind that what I'm going to be doing is critiquing certain scriptures and comparing it to known history and reaching some conclusions. That's what I do. And so my approach is very, very academic, and not meant as an insult to any religious group, because we've got to realize that the story of Moses and the Exodus is almost a central core to Judaism, as well as Christianity and Islam. All of these religions, the story of Moses and the Exodus it's mentioned in the Quran. Of course, it's mentioned in the Torah, the Tanakh, and as well as it's in the Christian Holy Bible. So this really hits a lot of people's nerve. And also on that note, I'd also like to say that I'm a little hesitant to talk about ancient Egypt. As I said, I did study Egyptology while I was in college, along with majoring in my master's in comparative religious studies. However, it seems whenever I talk about Egypt, and I have in two of my past videos, it seems to bring out, I don't know what it is about Egypt, but it seems to bring out all kinds of craziness, all of these New Age and outlandish theories, and even strange belief systems. A lot of modern mythology has been added to Egypt. You know, and seems like every whack job on the internet just really pounces on anything you talk about with Egypt. But you know, what I present is scholarly, is the known history. I don't go into crazy fantastical theories and with aliens, and nor does what I talk about have any type of social agenda, which a lot of people when it comes to ancient Egypt really do. What I say is what I have no agenda on it. What I say is what's the known facts, and the known data that we have. And same thing is going to be with when it comes to religion. So I'm really combining two elements that are going to be, could be a little explosive here. So I think the commentary is going to be really fun. Now, of course, the story of Moses is known pretty much worldwide, whether you be Christian or Jewish, or Muslim, or even of some other faith or no faith. Most people know this story. it's if in anything you've seen one of the movies, Prince of Egypt, or Cecil B. DeMille's famous The Ten Commandments, But this is a well-known story, and as I said, it is the basis for the Jewish faith. This is the start of the ceremonies, the traditions, the laws, which would follow into the books both in Exodus and within the first 5 books of Pentateuch. That give out the laws of Judaism, and of course this carries on into Christianity, which also has the old, what they call the Old Testament, better known as the Tanakh among Jewish people, the Jewish faith. And they also incorporated this into their own beliefs. It's part of the story that leads up into the stories of Christ. So, and of course the Quran speaks of Moses and the story of the Exodus. So these are the 3 big monotheistic faiths of the world, and of course their history. This story has affected their history and their beliefs, and their art for 1,000 years, for over 2,000 years. So when tackling this can be a little bit. And throwing a little bit of a critical and scholarly eye on it can be a bit, can border on possibly insulting someone's faith, which is never my intention. But for those that do not know the story of Moses, it is that back during the time of ancient Egypt, that the Hebrews, who would later become the Israelites, the ancestors of the modern Jewish people, were put into captivity in Egypt. That they had migrated there during the Great Flood, during the Great Famine, and that they had basically stayed in Egypt. So and they'd settled there. But then after several hundred years of being there, they were suddenly, the Egyptians became afraid of them and feared they may try to take over, and they enslaved them. And they remained slaves for 300 years until a young Hebrew there had been an order given out that all male Hebrews were to be killed by the Pharaoh. And one mother put her young baby into a basket, floated it down the Nile. It was found by a princess of Egypt, who took the baby, and she named it Moses because she drew him from the river, and she raised him as an Egyptian. Well, later on, he found out he killed an Egyptian, and he was driven from out of Egypt, and he was actually saw God, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who told him to go back and free his people. Thus he goes back to Egypt with a staff that was given, with his walking staff, which had certain powers given to it by God. And, he told the Pharaoh, let my people go. The Pharaoh refused. And what came after that was Moses said there will be certain plagues. There were 7 plagues. The Nile was turned to blood. The sky was turned to sackcloth and darkness for so many days. There was a pestilence in the fields, locusts, frogs, the dying, disease, and finally the death of the firstborn Egyptian son. And after that point, the Pharaoh said, "Yeah, go." So they left. The Pharaoh tried to follow. They parted the Red Sea. The Israel and the Hebrews passed through, but when the Pharaoh's men tried to pass through, they closed the water, and they all drowned. Then the Hebrews ended up wandering in the desert for 40 years until they finally settled into Israel, into the land of Canaan, where their promised land. But Moses had made a mistake. I won't go into all of that. He took claim for one of the miracles, and God would not allow him to pass into Israel. And so it said that actually God buried Moses. Nobody knows where he was buried. And that started the nation, the nation of Israel. So that's the basic story, if you didn't know it. Now, As I said, this has become a huge cultural thing, such a part of both Eastern, Middle Eastern, and Western culture because of the spread of Christianity. And this was accepted for a long time to be true historic fact. However, starting in about the 16th, 17th century, some scholars started they went to the Sinai deserts, and they found it hard to believe altogether anybody could live in that wasteland for 40 years, number one. And number two, they could find nothing, no evidence. And in fact, archaeologists for the last at least 200 years have searched that wasteland, and as well as scholars have searched, especially since we've been able to read hieroglyphics and Demotic and Hieratic, and read the ancient records left by the Egyptians. We found no clue to this story being true. No record in any Egyptian record, not a single out in the Sinai, not a single potsherd, not a fire pit, nothing. And it's going to be impossible for people to live in any area, even wandering around for 40 years, that they would not leave plenty of traces. So a lot of people came to doubt scholarly that this will ever happen. You know, the Egyptians never mentioned this, all these plagues and this insurrection and this exodus of people leaving and freeing all their slaves. There's no mention of it, as well as not a single piece of physical evidence from the Sinai. So thus, a lot of scholars now, and even today, consider this story to be a myth. In fact, scholarly, academically, that is the more common belief. That's a more commonly accepted conclusion. I personally, and a lot of other biblical scholars, as well as religious studies scholars, disagree. Now, I do believe there is something to this story, that it does have some sort of some historical basis, and I feel like there are clues for that. Now, of course, I don't think that it happened exactly as the text was said, which we're going to go into. That text was written at least 500, more like 600 years after the event. It was passed down orally before that. So, of course, the story can get bigger and changes can come in there before it was written down. So, the time it's written down, the story we have may be based on somewhat of a true story, but it's had a lot of elaboration, a lot of changes put to it for religious and even political reasons. So, but I do think there's something based upon it. Now, why do I think that? There's just too many little circumstantial pieces of evidence in both in the texts, in the laws, and their associations with ancient Egyptian culture and its religion and its practices. Even in the etymology of the name of Moses, which I'm going to go into, there's just too many coincidences, too many links to show kind of a hybrid between Egyptian belief and what would become ancient, ancient belief of Judaism. That for me, it's just too much of a coincidence for me to believe that this does not have some sort of basis in a real event. And we're going to go over that. Now, the first thing I'm going to go over here is how known history, what we know of ancient Egyptian history, may actually match this story in the book of Exodus of Moses. And the first thing we need to tackle is one of the oddest aspects of this story, and that is the enslavement of the Hebrews, who had already been there for several hundred years. And by that time had become very Egyptianized, obviously. You don't live in a country for 200 years that you don't become assimilated to that culture, at least in some way, and actually some pretty profound cultural and sociological ways. But now here's the thing: we know quite a bit about the ancient Egyptians, and what we do know is that it was not a common practice. In fact, it's unprecedented that Egyptians would suddenly enslave a group of people that were already living in Egypt, who were considered, by all rights and purposes, Egyptian themselves. Because in ancient Egypt was a bit of a melting pot. Like I said, a lot of people moved there because of the Nile and the fertile land. So you had people coming in from Africa who originally established it when the grasslands in Africa started drying up and that huge desert developed. They moved in to where the food was, but then also people from the Middle East moved in there. People from so it became very much a melting pot. So if you moved to Egypt, and you paid Egyptian taxes, you were an Egyptian. And especially, you may first generations may be looked at as differently, but within 50 to 100 years, they're going to be very assimilated. So it's very odd that the Egyptians, and it wasn't Egyptian practice to enslave the people that are already living there. Now, Egyptians, of course, like a lot of ancient people, did have slaves. However, most of their slaves came from captives of war. That was the normal policy. People got captured in war, or people got captured in war, or a city got captured in war, and they would enslave them. They would, they'd enslave the captives of war or the captives from a conquered city. That was the normal practice. But not to suddenly have a people that moved to Egypt, lived in Egypt 200 years, and then suddenly enslave them. So there's something, this is not typical for Egypt, and something had to have happened. And I think I know what. And there is a historical basis for why this enslaving of the Hebrews who had been there so long suddenly out of nowhere took place. And that has to do with the Hyksos. Now the Hyksos is a word that comes from it's an Egyptian word, and the Greekized version of an Egyptian word, which basically means the shepherd kings, or it could be said to mean the foreign kings. And what had happened was the famine that is mentioned in the Bible, the Great Famine, the 7-year famine, did take place. We know that from Egyptian record, from a stele in Egypt, and yes, there was this great famine, of course, that affected the Middle East. However, as I've said in my other video on Akhenaten, the Nile doesn't depend on those rains. They depend on the rains from out of Ethiopia and Africa that flood the Nile. They don't depend, so therefore there were a lot of refugees coming into Egypt because the food was there. You go where the food is if you're starving. And hence this would match with the story of Joseph in the Bible, of the people that moved in. And yes, we do know from Egyptian record, and even their artistic renditions, that there were a lot of people from Canaan, the areas of Canaan, that moved into Egypt. And in fact, one group, at least perhaps one particular group, become known as the Hyksos, and that and they didn't conquer Egypt. They just slowly moved in and took over. Over time they took over Lower Egypt, and they actually divided Egypt between Upper Egypt, the traditional Egyptians, and their traditional Egyptian pharaoh, and the Hyksos kingdom. And this division of Egypt stood for over 200 years. Now, this once again, here we are matching with the biblical story. And now, finally, in the 18th, at the end of the 17th dynasty, around about 1500 BCE, the royal family of Thebes, which was the traditional pharaohs, fought against the Hyksos, and actually at least 2 of the pharaohs were killed in battle with the Hyksos. And finally, one of the pharaohs almost managed to drive the Hyksos out of Egypt, reuniting Egypt into one kingdom of Upper and Lower Egypt. So, so they finally drove these people out. Now, I want you to consider this because, and we're going to look at a biblical verse here. Now, they've just drove out this one group, dominating group of Canaanites. And of course, they brought their culture in, and a lot of archaeological work has been done to finding Hyksos, monuments, which they become a mixture of Canaanite culture as well as Egyptian culture. They had melded over these, once again, assimilation. The melting pot. They really assimilated, but brought their own type of hybrid culture over that time. But now, the Egyptians had just got rid of this one group of Canaanites. Now, they look around, and here is this other group. They dress like the Hyksos. They look like the Hyksos. They speak a similar, if not the same, language as the Hyksos. And I'm talking about the Hebrews, which may be the Habaru that's mentioned in some Egyptian texts, though that's debated. Now, I want you to consider that, you just run out of people you let come in, and then they basically infiltrated and took over. And now you have another group that looks, acts, and talks just like them from a similar culture. And now let's look at the first chapter of Exodus here. And let's see what it says, and bear this in mind. And this is from 1st Exodus 8 through 12. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph, the patriarch that brought the Hebrews there. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people." I'm sure you call them Hebrews, but whatever. Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. Now, what does this tells us a lot right here. What does this tell us? It tells us that basically they looked at these people and be like, you know what, we just threw out a whole group that took us 200 years to get one group of Canaanites out, of these foreign people that took over Egypt and divided us for so long. And here we got this guy. No. We're going to nip this in the bud. They got, we're going to put chains on them. This isn't happening again. So in a lot of ways, the Egyptians did to the Egyptianized Hebrews what America did to the American Japanese during World War II with the internment camps, but even worse, they actually enslaved them. And that makes sense. That's why we have this exceptional situation of the Hebrews being enslaved. They weren't going to have another Hyksos situation. Put them in chains. We're not taking any chances. Nip this in the bud. And that's why. And it mentions a new Pharaoh. This very well could be Amos, and this who established the new kingdom. So the old kingdom, perhaps even the Hyksos themselves, were friends of the Hebrews, and related to the Hebrews. So this historically makes sense. In fact, it's said that the Hebrews were enslaved for 300 years. Well, Amos come to the throne in about 1550 BCE. And the other thing we learn from this text is that the cities that they built, Pithom and Ramses. Well, we know which city with Ramses was built, and I'll go into more of the historical data on this later. But we know that that's Ramses the Great, Ramses II, who was the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. So, who come to the throne in about 1270, around 1270 BCE. So between 1550 and 1550 and 1270, that's about 300 years. So that the historical data and the story there match. Now, as I was saying, that passage I just read from the first chapter of Exodus, not only does it give us an answer to why the Egyptians enslaved the Hebrews, but it also gives us an indication as to when this happened and under which pharaoh that it was that Moses would later confront. It mentions that they built the cities of Pithom and Ramses. Now, Pithom we don't know a lot about. It's never been completely identified. There are a few theories as to where it was. However, Ramses, the city of Ramses, or Ramses, we know. And that city was built, or at least restored, by Ramses the Great. And in fact, throughout the biblical text, throughout Exodus, they refer to him as Ramses. This almost has always been believed to refer to Ramses the Great, Ramses II, who was the third, like I said, the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. And the time period would fit, as I indicated before. However, there is a little bit of circumstantial proof for this. Ramses, first, I'll say, Ramses was one of the longer-lived pharaohs, and one of the great pharaohs, and big builders of ancient Egypt. You go to Egypt, his name, his cartouche, is on everything, and he built the huge monuments such as Abu Simbel. You know, those are all statues of him, the size of Mount Rushmore, the faces the size of Mount Rushmore. So, you know, Ramses was the great, the great pharaoh. And he ruled for 60 years. Now, most Egyptians died in their 40s, but Ramses II, died in his 90s. We actually have his mummy in the Cairo Museum. It's very apparent he was a 90-year-old man. So the Egyptians probably thought he was never going to die. So, but, you know, he actually lived so extraordinarily long that we know he outlived his first 12 crown princes, his first 12 eldest sons in a row. It was actually his 13th son, Merentau, who was his 13th son from his second favorite wife, who finally succeeded to the throne. In fact, Ramses is believed to have had as many as 108 children. It's good to be the king. Very prolific man. And in fact, it is from Merentau that we find some evidence for Israel and for the Exodus. It was a common practice for pharaohs to go on a war campaign about every 10 years. Just let everybody know who's in charge. And they would stomp the crap out of certain towns and city-states or countries and get their to keep that tribute coming in. And they put up these steles, these stone monuments of tablets to commemorate the pharaoh's campaign. And and there are a lot of these things around. You know, Ramses, there's quite a few. Obviously, you know, he ruled for 60 years. But Merentau put one up that was found, and all the lists, and just one that's just mentioned in the list of, it's like we conquered this city and this group, we took this and we destroyed this group, and in the middle of the middle is one that says, and Israel was waylaced and no longer bears seed, and it is the first historic reference to Israel in history. Now, what's interesting is if you go to the steles for Ramses 10 years before, and you know, and all the way back, there's no mention of Israel. So this seems to be a new nation. Now, if you do the calculation, if you go back 40 years, if they did wander in the desert for 40 years, and you go back, then that would put, you know, in fact, the text itself does not say this. The nation of it is Israel. It has the determinative for tribe. So the tribe of Israel was laid waste. So there's some speculation it's before they settled. So, you know, either way, if you put it back in time, it puts the Exodus squared in the time of Ramses the Great, and he really fits the bill. So, you know, even though that's the only real evidence that we have, and with the physical evidence that we have with the text, with the text in the scripture, it does match. So most likely, we are talking about Ramses the Great. Now, another thing I'd like to dispel right here, we do know about ancient Egypt, and that is the slavery in ancient Egypt. Now, a lot of people when they think of the slaves of the Hebrews in Egypt, they think of what I call the Cecil B. DeMille version, where they're all pulling on the ropes and chiseling and building these great Egyptian monuments, you know, with the taskmasters out there whipping them and all that. Any type of slavery is never nice. It's always abominable. However, it's not quite the way it happened. The Egyptians did not build those. I mean, the Hebrews did not build slave labor did not build those great monuments. We know that. For one thing, those monuments were carved with such perfection and with such draftsmanship and engineering. These we know from the records were worked on by very highly well-paid and very highly skilled craftsmen and engineers and masons, not slaves. In fact, I doubt that even the slaves are pulling the ropes, because even that was a very technical job. And there were Egyptians who trained their entire life to be able to carve these monuments or build these monuments. And they had architects, they had engineers, they had draftsmen. You know, even to move them, you know, required trained engineers. You know, they would apprentice, you know, from childhood until they mastered the skills. None of this was done by slaves, and that's backed up by the biblical text. What does it say the Hebrews were put to doing? Making the mud bricks. Now, most things in Egypt were made from mud brick, not the great stone monuments. That was for temples and temples and historic monuments. But everything else was made of mud bricks. So they needed them by the billions, and so they were stomping the straw into the mud, and then take the mud, put it in a set mold, let it dry, and repeat 1 billion times. This was back-breaking, hard, nasty weather work. Done in the hot sun. It was torturous, monotonous, task, and that's what the Hebrews are put into doing. I'm sure they also served as house servants, and they probably did work in the quarries, cleaning up. They weren't doing the high technical stuff. That was done by the trained professionals. They were the grunt labor, and that was it. And in fact, we have that in Exodus, where the Pharaoh, when he becomes angry, Moses tells him, "Make your bricks without straw," which would make their task that much harder because they'd have to cut their own straw. So that right there shows what they were really doing. But yet in the movies, you always see that. Even the pyramids weren't built by slave labor. We know that for a fact. They were built by paid labor, and in fact, they were treated very well. We found their bones, and they had good nutrition. We even found broken bones that had been professionally set by a doctor. You don't do that with slaves. So because basically it was like a WPA system. You work your fields 3 months out of the year. Then what do? Go work for the Pharaoh. He'll pay you in bread and beer, and paying me in beer would probably work today. And he got the best, compared to the farming and the planting in the back, pulling on ropes and chiseling on stone was a cushy job. So that's the way that the pyramids were built. Horribly expensive. That's the reason they had to stop, but not from slave labor. Well, now that I've covered a little bit of the history, linking it to ancient Egypt and the historical, how the story of Exodus can be linked to the story and history of ancient Egypt, I'll talk about a few of the clues that are found in the Hebrew scripture, in the text of the book of Exodus, and that indicate to me that it is based on something that really happened. And one of the first that I'll talk about, first let's establish about when this text was actually written down. From what we can tell, it was during the Babylonian exile of Israel, and maybe just after that. So we're talking about around 500 BCE to 600 to 500 BCE, and we believe that it was probably canonized within the Jewish scriptures around 400 BCE. So now, if the Exodus took place during the reign of Ramses the Great, say around 1250 BCE, then that is a gap of about 600 to 700 years or more. And before this would have been an oral story passed down. So, and of course, oral stories get added to and elaborated upon, as I said earlier. So, the text that we have was written, almost half a millennium after this had happened. So, of course, that would call the historic, some of the historic basis of some of the details of Exodus into question. And of course, you're going to get a lot of symbolism in there. You're going to get a lot of political statements and religious political statements in that text, which we're going to kind of go over. Another thing is, it's commonly believed and even kind of stated that the book of Exodus, as well as the other 5 books, were written by Moses himself. Well, that is, a lot of religious people believe that. However, scholars looking at the text and the different styles in the text, see, as well as some contradictions in the text, see that it was probably written by at least 3 to 4 different authors over time, or at least those that added to the story and updated and edited the story over time. We do find some mistakes, like for instance, in Some parts of the Exodus they name Moses' father as Jethro, and other parts it's Reuel. And when he gets the 10 Commandments from the mountain, sometimes it's called Mount Sinai, other times it's called Mount Horeb. So there are these contradictions. Also the numbers of how many people there were and all this contradiction. And even the number of the 10 Commandments, sometimes if you read them, there's really more than 10. And so when they're repeated several times, but sometimes that number differs. It's classically come down to 10, but if you go back and read the text where it talks about the 10 Commandments and start counting, you're going to find it's actually a few more at certain parts. So therefore, yes, this story, and even the text itself, when it was written down, was worked over, edited, changed over time. I know that may be disturbing some people that think that this is literally the Word of God, but examination of the text, the exegesis of the text, the literary criticisms and analysis of the text shows that it was written by multiple hands. That's true of the entire Bible. The Bible was written over about 1,000-year period. But anyway, so therefore there's a few things in there that are really kind of interesting. Now first, let's talk about the plagues. Now, in the story, as I said before, every time the Pharaoh would refuse to let the people go, Moses would pronounce a plague on Egypt. And there is no record of these plagues in ancient Egypt. You would think, the Egyptians recorded a lot, and you would think that this would have been commemorated. Could be argued that, this was kind of a defeat for the Egyptians. And how many monuments does a nation build to their defeats? How many monuments do we have in America to a lost battle? Unless it's a civil war, but that's us fighting ourselves. About the only one I can think of is Pearl Harbor. But then we won the war. So it was, but generally nations don't build monuments to their own defeats. So that could be one answer. But there's also another answer, and it's that each one of these plagues happened to be a challenge to an Egyptian god. It's the Hebrew god showing he's more powerful than the Hebrew god is more powerful than the Egyptian gods. For instance, Ra and Horus was the god of the sun. Well, the sun, the plague where the sun was taken away and darkness reigned over Egypt. That's so. So Yahweh is greater than Ra. They worship the Nile, the spirit of the Nile. Well, they turn the Nile to blood. The very life force of Egypt. So Yahweh is greater than the Nile. And the Ma'at brought by the Nile. Then you have the plagues of the pestilence brought on both the people and the blighting of the fields. Well, Osiris and Isis were fertility gods. So Yahweh is greater than Isis and Isis and Osiris. The cattle and the locusts and the cattle dying. He's greater than Hathor, and this goes on and on and on. Each one is showing that, hey, the Hebrew God of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now Moses, is greater than your God. And what's really kind of interesting there is that we think and like in the movies they portray it as like, well, they don't exist because the belief in monotheism that really is inflicted upon this text. But in truth, this is more of a henotheistic approach. Note in the text it never says that these gods aren't real, just that the Hebrew God is greater. In fact, I think it's in Hebrew. Let's take a look at the text again. I think in the Hebrew, the Exodus 12:12, he makes a very interesting statement here. If I can get to the part, bear with me. Yes. Note what he says here, and this is in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Note, he's at war with the gods of Egypt. Doesn't say they're not real gods. He's inflicted on humans, animals, and the gods. Not the false gods of Egypt. The gods. And think about even the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. No other false gods. That's not in the text. So this is my dog. Our dog is meaner than your dog, Egyptians. Our God can just annihilate all of yours. So that's what I'm seeing the 7 plagues is. Not something that really happened, but more of a statement that the Hebrew God, Yahweh, he whose name should not be spoken, was, the God of no real name. The name who is I am that I am is greater than your God. I find that very telling right there. So that's one thing. Now the other another thing about the text that seems to point to there being something true and historical about Exodus is the name of Moses himself. Now Moses, it says in Exodus chapter 2 verse 10 that when the princess took him from the water, she named him Moses, which means because she took him from the water. Now, which actually means, now the word Moses means, and it is an Egyptian word, and it means born of. And it was a very common part of an Egyptian name. But to call him Moses is not Egyptian. That's half of a name. Usually, like I said, it means born of. So we see it with a lot of the pharaohs, like Ramses, born of Ra, Tutmosis, born of Thoth, Amun-Moses, born of Ammon. Every time the word Moses is used, there is an Egyptian god's name attached to it, born of this god. You would never name someone just Moses, just born of. It'd be like, my name's Timothy. It'd be like calling me Othie. It would make no sense. So, and no Egyptian's going to do that. So therefore, what this tells me is that Moses had an Egyptian name. And most likely, almost definitely, had the name of an Egyptian god in front of it, whether it be Ramoses, Tammoses, Amun-Moses, Tutmosis. It had an Egyptian god's name. Well, when he becomes the prophet of the Hebrew God Yahweh, you can't really have a prophet of the God Yahweh named born of Ra or born of Thoth. So what do? They just cut that God's name off. You're just Moses. Now that's not an Egyptian name. That is a religio-political decision. And that right there tells me that the fact that his name is Moses, this odd name, half of an Egyptian name, they cut the God's name off, tells me there's something to this story. Why else would they, if it's just mythical, why else do they use this weird name? So that tells me there's something to it. Also, remember I said there's no record of Moses whatsoever that we know of in any Egyptian script or record or on any wall. Or is there? Because you may have figured it out. If his name was Ramoses, if his name was Amun-Moses, Tutmosis, Tammoses, whatever it was, if they had an image of him on a wall with it would have his Egyptian name. So we may be looking at the real Moses, a depiction of him on some Egyptian wall as a royal or as a scribe or anything, and we wouldn't know it because it'd have his Egyptian name. Think about that. Now, another thing I want to address is exactly what was Moses' ethnicity. Was he Hebrew? Now, of course, we have in the story of the basket. He's put in a basket, floated down the river, he's Hebrew, but he's being raised Egyptian. Now, there's a problem here. Because that story of a royal baby put in a basket, or a baby put in a basket adopted by someone else, was a very common theme used in the royal propaganda of different ancient countries in that part of the world. In fact, Sargon the Great had the exact same story. He came much earlier. You know, the first Sumerian, really emperor of the world that we know of. There's the story that, you know, he was actually of the royal family, but they put him in a basket, floated him down the river. He was found by a ditch digger who raised him. Why would they come up with this story? It more fit with both their cosmology and their social structure, because the royals were the nobles. They were descended from the gods. You know, they were separate from the people. They were the royal noble blood, and only therefore they were destined by the gods, or at least in their society, to rule. Well, if you had somebody usurp them, overthrow their kingdom, and take over, and you happen to not come from that bloodline, that's not fitting with your belief system and your social structure. And so therefore, Sargon the Great was the son of a ditch digger, rose up in political power, military power, and he took over the country and become king. You know, but he's not of noble blood, so this can't be. How can a commoner do this? That goes against the social structure and the religious beliefs and the social beliefs. Well, then you get a spin doctor. You know, well, he's not really the son of a ditch digger. He's actually the son of the royal family, and they hit him, and put him in a basket, and he was raised by this ditch digger. But his true origins is he is royal, and the social beliefs and social structure is therefore safe. This was used repeatedly. Sargon's just the best known example. They also did something very similar when Ptolemy, the first Ptolemy, became Pharaoh of Egypt. Alexander conquered Egypt, conquered Persia, and got Egypt. When he died, his generals divided his huge empire among themselves. Ptolemy, whose father had been a goat herder, and he'd been a very close friend of Alexander's, got Egypt. Well, how can you have a goat herder's son as Pharaoh of Egypt? Well, he's not really the goat herder's son. He was actually fathered along with Alexander by Zeus, and thus he is Alexander's brother and the son of a god. Not a goat herder's son. This is common ancient propaganda. We see it over and over again. So what does that tell us about this story about Moses? Well, it could be one of two things. One, either that Moses was Hebrew, but may have been from a class of people that had reached a certain status that they weren't enslaved. That's a possibility. That always happens. You know, that usually happens in most enslaved societies. There will be certain exemption groups there because of money, economics, because of court favor. Or, which I think is more likely, could be that Moses is actually not Hebrew, but an Egyptian. And they made this story to make him Hebrew. Got to consider it, and it's got to be one of the two, because that the coincidence that this propaganda story that's used over and over again was used with Moses has to have some sort of political agenda. Now, another similarity that we can go over, that another piece of evidence that shows me that that Moses and the Exodus took place in Egypt, is some of the practices that are first introduced by Moses in his laws and in his description of how to do the rituals and how to set up the tabernacle, as well as the Ark of the Covenant. All of these elements that you see are very obvious Egyptian hybrids of Egyptian beliefs and their own ritual practices. For instance, if you look at the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Covenant was a box with rails on the side, and inside the box was put the Ten Commandments, the budding rod of Aaron, and a cup of manna, which was the food that God dropped down so that the Hebrews could eat in the desert. It was told by God, by Yahweh, to be put in this chest, closed, And on top it had the cherubs, two winged beings pointing toward each other with a seat on top, and with wood poles on either side for it to be carried. And it gives great details as to the colors and the type of ritual bathing and the cloth to be used for the people that carried it, and all of that. Now, that is a purely Egyptian adaptation of an Egyptian ritual. The Egyptians, but it is a hybrid of the belief system, because in Egypt it was very common. We found an Ark of the Covenant, or basically Tutankhamun's tomb with the jackal god Anubis on top of it. Basically, what the Egyptians did, they built these type of chests with the running poles, which have almost the exact same dimensions as described in the Bible, and they would put some sacred text inside of it, and on top there would be a throne, there'd be a seat, and on that seat they would take the statue of the god, and the god during different gods during different seasons would travel from one temple to the next in this great procession, carried by the priests, and there'd be a party, and it was a huge festival when the god would move from one place to the other. This is still done in some religions, and in some, in Catholicism, that this happens with some statues of saints, and also if you think about the Yatra, the Ratha Yatra, when they move Jagannath from one temple to the next in Orissa, and once a year in this great procession, in Hinduism. So this is still something still practiced, and the Egyptians would do this. Now think about what the Ark of the Covenant is. It's the same thing. They're carrying him from God from one place in Egypt to their home in Canaan or Israel, and they're carrying it in this great procession. However, the seat on top is empty, because the God Yahweh has no image. He's beyond image. So same ceremony, same practice, but with their own religious twist to it. There is the throne of God on top of this ark that is empty. It is from there that God communicated. Yahweh communicated with the future Israelites. So this is an adapted Egyptian religious practice. Now, another one that we can point out, I can actually point out another couple, is some of the rituals. It's how the sacrifice. You find this in Numbers and Leviticus and in these books. They talk about how to dress and how to do it, and how the incense is to be used and the oil is to be used, and the ritual bathing and all of this. Well, when Herodotus, the great Greek historian, went to Egypt in around 400 BCE, he did descriptions that he saw of Egyptian rituals, and if you lay what he said side by side with these laws and these rituals in the Bible, they match almost perfectly. It's the same ceremony that they've. So once again, this shows that these people, that the Hebrews had been assimilated in Egypt. They were used to these customs. Maybe they had already adapted them to their own worship of their own gods, a god or gods. And now with these texts of Moses, it's being put down in a form of law. This is showing a hybrid of a people assimilated, a hybrid of a religion assimilated into another culture. And it gives you this hybrid of a new religious culture, which would end up being Judaism. So there, we have that. Now, also, there's other practices that we have in ancient Egypt that was obviously adopted by the Hebrews, and one is circumcision. Now we have the story of circumcision from Genesis with Abraham, and as part of the covenant in the flesh. However, a lot of scholars now believe that Genesis was actually written later, after Exodus. And maybe part of a whole other story to support everything. I'll go into that in a minute. But either way, the truth is that the Egyptians circumcised. And one of the few people that actually did this. They actually started the practice, as far as we know, at least in that part of the world. And in fact, there was a funny, little, and kind of gruesome history to that and evidence for that. With one of the temples of Ramses III, I believe, there's a depiction of all these severed, uncircumcised penises that an accountant is counting. And what had happened was that they won a great battle, and the pharaoh wanted to know the exact count of the enemies killed. Well, they did the count with hands, cutting off the hands, and they counted the hands. Well, when the pharaoh saw that, he's like, yeah, but there are 2 hands. How do I know you're not doubling the number here? It's a really impressive number. He said, there are 2 hands, and how do I know you're not using the hands of the dead Egyptians that you're throwing in there? So, what's the one thing that a man only has one of? Cut that off and we'll count those. And not only that, you know, they would be uncircumcised. So you can't use the Egyptian dead penises because they're circumcised. So you know your count is right, which of course the count was the same, of course. That Egyptians are very anal, but on these type of things. So there it does show that the Egyptians did circumcise, and of course you have circumcision as part of the law of Judaism. So it seems to have come out of Egypt, just like the Ark of the Covenant, just like the rituals that they use. And another interesting thing is, especially in Lower Egypt, and Egyptians would go back and forth on this one, that Egyptians were forbidden, it was considered a curse, to eat pork. Yeah, you ever wonder where they come from? Why they don't eat pork? Looks like this. The reason being is the lower part of Egypt, and especially in and around Avaris, which is was maybe where Petham was located. The city they said to build may have been in the nome of the god Set, who was considered kind of the bad god, the god of chaos. And one of the totem animals, along with an ass, a donkey or an ass, and a dog for the god Set was a pig. In fact, he's portrayed sometimes as a pig in some of the artwork. Therefore, you did not eat the sacred animal of the god of chaos. It was considered bad, evil and bad. And apparently, the Hebrews picked up this custom while they were there, assimilated for several hundred years, and they didn't eat pork. Plus, you go into the health thing, it's hard to preserve pork, especially in a hot climate and all of that. But I think it had more of a religious point, and it got transferred. So there, between the Ark of the Covenant, the rituals used, the name of Moses, the not eating pork, circumcision, all of these were Egyptian practices and Egyptian names. And to me, this points that there has to be some sort of basis of fact in the story of Moses. Probably did not happen the way that it's portrayed. It's been portrayed in the text, which was written 700 years later, 600 to 700 years later, and worked over for at least another 100 years in editing. But it is based on something. So what happened? What is the true story? What was the Exodus? Was there a real Moses? I think that there was because of this name. But what really happened? Well, there is a more modern theory that I'll go over, and it's known as the Insurrection Theory. Now, the Insurrection Theory has come up in the last couple of decades, and it holds that the story of the Exodus did take place. However, it took place for different reasons and in a different social structure than what is held in the book of Exodus. And it basically goes, and here a lot of people like to try and link Akhenaten to Moses. I don't think there's any real link there at all, religiously. This is 2 completely different types of movement. A lot of people try to say, oh, it was monotheism of Atonism, and helped create the monotheism of Judaism. We have no basis for that. In fact, monotheism did not start developing in the Hebrew in Judaism actually until the Babylonian period. That's when they were exiled from their country, because their belief was like most beliefs, that there were gods of certain nations in a certain area, a certain region. And theirs was the God of Israel, the God of Canaan, and that this God had come. That's the reason they had to carry him back in the Ark of the Covenant, because he'd come to get them back and take them back to where they were from. Take them back to their land. They had their temple, and that was the center of their religion. He was the God of Israel. But just like with the God, the Ethnism of the Amarna period of Akhenaten, this was not a form of monotheism at all. It's a form of henotheism. Yes, there are other gods, but our God is greater. Monotheism means there is only one God, and all other gods don't exist. That's not what either one of these traditions at this time were saying. They were saying, yes, there are all these other gods, but ours is the greatest, and that's known as henotheism. So this is a henotheistic religion, just like we saw in that biblical text I talked about, where Yahweh said he was going to war, and he's taking to judgment the Egyptian gods. Not that they didn't exist, just he was more powerful than they were. So neither one. So it's not like you get monotheism from that Moses got monotheism from Akhenaten, because neither one were monotheistic. So that was something that developed about 500 years, at least 500 years later, and actually come from more out of the Babylonian exile. So we can rule that out. But Akhenaten does come into this because of the political effect that he had. If you go back and watch my video, my most popular video on this particular channel, about you will see that I talked about that because the Ethnism failed, it caused a certain disillusionment in the divinity of the Pharaoh. That Egypt never really dropped, never really lost. It was a crack that just kept growing over the next couple of hundred years, till finally the Pharaoh fell to the high priest. The pharaonic power fell to the high priest of Amun when he became Pharaoh. So the representative of God overtook the divinity of the Pharaoh. And this seems to have been going on even during the time of Ramses. This would have taken a place about 80 to 100 years, like about almost 100 years later. And I think that what had happened with Akhenaten had affected the Egyptians. They were no longer so much seeing their pharaoh as truly divine. It was become basically lip service, which kind of makes sense, because if you go back to the Old Kingdom, the pharaohs had been pharaohs from the beginning with Narmer, and the Old Kingdom, it lasted all these hundreds of years. He was an absolute god. But then the Old Kingdom fell, and basically the nomarchs, the local governors of regions, of the districts, become powerful, and there was no pharaoh, and they established basically fiefs of the little feudal kingdoms, until finally another pharaoh man come along, defeated them, and reestablished the pharaonic power. That was become the Middle Kingdom. And then of course the Hyksos come along, did the same thing, divided Egypt. So between there, the pharaoh whose whole job is to hold Egypt together and keep the balance of Ma'at between the gods, the people, and the land. And suddenly that's failed now miserably twice. And now you've had a pharaoh that was actually heretical to the entire gods of Egypt except one. So that's really going to affect that view of the pharaoh as divine. And that I think that there's a common belief now among scholars that, or speculation I should say, based on some of the evidence, that this caused some insurrections and some groups to even, because when they take that away from he's not divine, then it become much more just purely political, and you had people that would protest against this. And this looks like it may have happened during the reign of Ramses the Great, because that they no longer saw him as divine. You had a lot of these extra people in Egypt as well. So the loss of this absolute sovereign divine rule of the pharaoh wasn't quite there the way it was before, and dissatisfied people who were slaves, people who were not, who were the poor working people. You had the royalty, the nobles, and the poor. They may have rebelled, and that's what we think that happened, is that there was a rebellion in Egypt, not just among the Hebrews or the Habaru, but may have actually been from a whole bunch of different people from different regions that had come into Egypt. And there's even some evidence in there. I think it is in 12, chapter 12, verse 38. It says that when Moses took the people out, the Hebrews out of Egypt, that a mix of people went with him. Who are these mix of people? I think this was everybody else. I think this, people from all over the place. It was a melting pot. Egypt was a melting pot, and so would have been the lower populations, the lower class population. So people from Africa, people from the other parts of the Middle East, people from people from Arabia, all these people that had contact, had been in Egypt, had been enslaved in Egypt, or were the poor of Egypt. It looks like they band together and they left. and they probably may have even fought their way out. And perhaps, obviously, they must have had a leader. And maybe this had even become a religious leader, of a new god that was greater than the Pharaoh. So, led by a man who may have even been Egyptian by birth, or at least an assimilated Hebrew. And, who may have had an Egyptian name like Ramses or Tutmosis or Amun-Moses or whatever. But now he was a prophet, a spokesman for this new god that represented this conglomeration of people. So we cut his name off and he just becomes Moses. And he let us out. Now, it still doesn't answer the question as to why we don't find any clues for this Exodus. Well, what could have happened, this is speculation, is that you can trust the numbers in this text that was written 700 years before. The Lord's going to go more grand. So, these thousands and thousands of people, couldn't have survived out in that desert. I mean, I know about the so-called miracles and all that, but let's bring it down to real. Even if there were miracles, they would have left something. There's nothing left out there. I think that this migration may have been more than one, maybe several. People, maybe Moses' group with this conglomeration left maybe a few hundred, maybe even a couple of thousand, no more than that. They left, and there'd be, to find clues if they went straight through, not wandering for 40 years, straight through and they settled, and other groups kind of followed. Word got around, and other groups kind of migrated and followed them. That wouldn't leave a lot of trace. I should still find something, but that's a big waste to be out there. But it's obvious we don't have thousands of people living out in that desert for 40 years. And where did they go? They ended up in what is present-day Israel, beneath Mount Israel. So, and what's interesting about this is that it took place in 1200 BCE. Now, in 1200 BCE is the start of the Iron Age. For that, it was used of bronze. Now, iron was being used, and this may have an agricultural source, because the ground there in Israel is extremely hard, and you gotta get below the surface to get to the good topsoil to grow. Well, bronze plows would not do so hot on that. However, iron will. So suddenly they have iron. And this could have affected the whole thing. Now they could get deeper and plow and really plant crops. So this could be that this group, the speculation of the insurrections, this group moved there. And that there was already kind of a tribe of people there that they mixed with. And that they brought with the iron and all that, they established a new nation. Which would answer why Marantal Stella speaks of the tribe of Israel, because Israel had now been established by these groups that had moved out over the last 40 or 50 years. So it does, historically, all of that matches. It matches the technology of the time. It matches the time period between when they would have left and settled. It answers the questions that are in the text about the mixed people that went with them. This could have been literally the real birth, not Abraham and all that, but this could be the real birth of the Jewish people. This conglomeration of low class and slaves that stood up, held an insurrection, and left. And they established their own nation and their own new religion that would eventually become monotheistic and become one of the greatest faiths of the ancient world. And its children, Christianity and Islam, would dominate the world, the religious world, even to today. I find that I do not find that insulting. I find that this proposed history, I don't find that insulting. I find that a compliment to, and an honor to a very great, brave people that stood up against tyranny, and they had a great leader, and they left and they established their own nation that affected the rest of the history of the world. Well, okay, folks, that's all I've got today about Moses, the Exodus, and ancient Egypt. I hope I didn't step on too many faithful toes. Remember, I am speaking from a scholarly perspective, and what I present is the known data and the exegesis from the text, and try to in comparison with the historical and archaeological data and the best conclusions that come from those. And I think that this insurrection theory, though really no more physical proof for it or evidence than for the more faithful belief in the fundamental belief in the Exodus, but the history, the sociology, and the religious heritage all seem to fit with this theory, and with what we know of Egyptian culture, and what we know of Jewish, of early Israelite culture, it does seem to all fit. So you can take it with a grain of salt. Hey, it'll get you to maybe you can look some of this stuff up yourself. If I get you doing that, then I've kind of done my job. And so, you know what? Get yourself a book, even if it is the good book. Find yourself a comfy chair, and you pursue your passion. Later.